don't care about what some politician's intellectual gibber was going about.
Politician.
Hey, Joel, you have to restrain yourself. The wild Ukubian is coming out. Restrain yourself. I am putting forward the view that Australian workers only cared about so-called race and foreigners coming to their land because it was competition in the labor market.
Yeah,
if someone else wanted to, I can read you something too.
Prime Minister.
That was a politician. That wasn't a representative. That wasn't the representative of, and I'll tell you why. Because during the Eureka Rebellion, which you're saying only had 2 Chinese people, in the lead-up year, the Diggers, which were the people behind it, pushed unity across national racial lines. George Thompson's paper, The Diggers, this is before the 1900s, by the way. This was among the actual Australian workers, not derivative politicians, reading into it with this nonsense metaphysical gibber about race. The Diggers advocates stridently argue that the Chinese were welcome and for hostility to be directed instead at the race of capitalists, which was invading the goldfields. A spokesman for the Castlemaine Diggers expressed their desire to welcome the Chinese as brethren with open arms. And what happened after the defeat of the rebellion? The British started to try to persecute the rebels on the basis of saying that they were subversive foreigners, including Italians, Jamaicans, and the prominent former American black slave, John Joseph. So you see, the Royal Commission, which crushed this rebellion, started introducing this racial division after this rebellion because they realized when these Australian miners started uniting regardless of race, it could really pose a fighting chance against the British. And that's what you're ignoring about Australian history.
No, I'm not ignoring anything. This is just a selective communist reinterpretation of history when the entire vein of this movement that you are describing was always incredibly racialist. A lot of the leaders of the Eureka Stockade actually ended up going on to becoming politicians in Victoria, because at the time Australia didn't exist yet, so it was Victoria. And when they got in charge of Victoria, or they got influence in Victoria, they pushed and successfly implemented immigration and restriction policies on the basis of race. So
why did they in order to set what was the need by their constituents? Why did they receive pressure to implement these policies? What was the Are you really mean to tell me
working class were a bunch of racist tars, and they actually still are? I know them 'cause I'm one of them. I move among.
We can get to that in a second. But you really mean to tell me that the root cause of that racism lied in some kind of intellectually contrived gibber about the purity of the race, rather than the clear-cut observation that these people are coming here willing to work for much cheaper than we are, depreciating our fucking wages, on top of all the other cultural differences, which I'm sure you would emphasize? You don't think the root cause... You seriously mean to tell me that when people actually are in a shared boat and feed themselves in the exact same way, working in the same workplaces, getting paid the same wages, having the same predicament, having the same situation, basically, economically, as far as how they sustain themselves, you think there's really a huge cause for racial hatred and division there? I can see among the blue-collar working class of my own country. Sure, everyone's racist and vulgar, but when you have all these different races working in the same fucking factories, dealing with the same bosses, dealing with the same bullshit of having your benefits cut, not having correct health care or anything, guess what? It creates a lot of solidarity between people that allows them to look past these superficial differences. You only focuses on the only racial differences you ever focus on are different patterns of consumption. But what about labor? What about the actual thing that produces nations, literally feeds people and builds the things that people rely on to actually exist as human beings? You don't think that's fundamental? You don't think that's a fundamental factor in racial division? Because it is.
You know what a fundamental factor in racial division is? When I talk to my fellow members of the white working class, one of the number one things they complain about are fucking retard Indians and Chinese fresh off the boat, and how they don't do their job properly, how they're incompetent, how they endanger other workers with their incompetence because they don't have the same cultural standards that we have. They don't have the same confidence.
What about the same skill? Do they have the English properly? Do they have the same skill and experience? Okay, hypothetically, what if there was a Chinese guy? Be honest here. And you're in front of everyone, so we're going to see how honest you are. A Chinese guy speaks perfect English, works more or less in the same way as white Australians. You think they would really have a fucking problem with him if he's on the job site? He's basically doing the same thing as anyone else. You really think they're going to sit here?
We're talking about generalities.
Yeah, we are. We're talking about generalities that are not themselves rooted in race necessarily, but rooted in class differences. Because someone who's fresh off the boat comes from a different class context, different national context of class struggle, and a different class background in the first place. I'm not denying that class difference exists, and I'm not denying that is actually the form in which racial enmity and hostility takes place oftentimes. What I reject is the idea is that there's some kind of inborn blood-based hatred people have for each other for no fucking reason. That's nonsense. People don't have an issue with each other when they feed themselves in the same fucking way, just as Les said. So what you're talking about are people who are on the same job site, clearly not working in the same way.
Anyway, I want to kind of turn this back to the actual thing I wanted to debate with you, which is, and this actually gets us there, if this is a good segue, because what I am saying is, my argument is that race is the type of human that you are, that the kind of moral, ethical, cultural characteristics that people develop, even if they are born, like even a Chinese guy that's born in Australia and is raised in Australia, they still have many Chinese tendencies or Indian, whatever their ancestry is. It still comes through in their personality, because at the end of the day, your ancestry determines so much about the kind of person that you are, your attitudes, your mentality, how you process the world. The genes that code for neurophysiology are some of the largest divergences between the races. But also, I think
you mean the ones that don't exist?
Deeper than just this.
You mean the genes that don't exist? There are, to be clear, there are no genes that can account for neurodiversity. There are no genes that they have found that can account for neurodiversity, let alone genes that they can distribute across racial lines and all this other nonsense. You're talking about deceptions and trickery and nonsense and statistical fraud that occurs on a mass scale in these scientific publications. I mean, we could go down that road if you want, but going down that road is pretty stupid. I don't want to have
some debate over.
Yeah, you're right. It's nebulous. I agree. It's nebulous. Even if we agree that there's a fundamental difference in temperament between people who have different ancestral backgrounds that were somehow selected for
common sense. I don't even need a theory of
shut the fuck up for a second. That were selected for 200,000 years ago. It is historically irrelevant. It has no explanatory value when it comes to actually explaining why nations develop in the way they do, why histories take the forms that they do. You want to know what does explain the development of nations? You want to know what does explain why history goes in the directions that it does, how different disparate people become amalgamated into great nations and great empires? It's class struggle. It's different ways of life coming into contact, struggling thereof, or amalgamating and uniting in a new kind of way. But it's always about the fundamental form of labor and production. How do people produce the things that they need to survive and exist? This is what is fundamental to the development of history. The so-called racial categories that you're talking about, if we entertain that they exist, those were from 200,000 years ago. They don't explain anything about Australian sovereignty. They don't explain anything in particular about history. You are a country under occupation, literally, by the people who rule my country. You're literally an occupied country. You think the best course of action right now is to start whipping up racial hatred? You're playing into the hands of the liberals. You want to know something? It's always working class politics that they suppress. It's always real left-wing politics, not the woke stuff, not the identity politics, united working class politics that they're always suppressing. Why? Because every time we come around and build united working class forms of politics and discourse, they call us racist. They call us Nazis. They call us hateful people. They call us what you literally openly avow yourself. And why? Because you play into their hands. Because they can convince the masses of people that Nazis are bad people, that racists are bad people. Why? Because most people aren't like you. They're decent. They don't believe in racial hatred. They don't believe that someone is born being inferior or lesser than they are. It contradicts the fundamental Christian values upon which Western nations are founded. Most people don't have that view. Okay? So when you're playing into the hands of the liberals and the capitalist class, you're creating this false dialectic and dichotomy that they want. Why is it that they have been able successfully to root out real left-wing politics? politics, even in Australia itself. Where are the left-wingers in Australia? What do you have? People in fucking universities talking about how we need to decolonize Australia and all this queer theory, LGBT nonsense? You really think that isn't a ploy by the capitalist class to destroy working class movements and politics? You gotta be really asleep right now.
Points. The working class politics of Australia, until it was subverted by these nefarious forces that I think both of us could probably agree, the university sociology degree faggots that have taken over the labor movement and the left. Prior to them hijacking the left and directing it towards, the current agenda of, progressive, liberal, whatever the fuck you want to call it, cultural politics, it was run by white nationalists. The labor movement in Australia was run always by white nationalists, not by Marxists. Marxism never had very much of anything to do with Australian political history. They never had a big presence here. We had a racist, nationalist left wing. Okay? So that's the history of my country. That's what makes sense to me.
Once again,
your categories don't.
Once
your
again,
categories don't apply
white
to
nationalism.
Marxism has never been fucking relevant to my country.
And that's why, I agree. Marxism never took root in Australia, which is why it got fucked over in the way it did. I agree. But here's the problem.
The reason why I got fucked over. The reason why I got fucked over was because of the concerted ideological effort across the West. You are correct that my country is under occupation. That there's a concerted ideological effort across the West by the American-led international order to reconstruct the ideological structure of the West around an anti-racist ideology. When you say, "Oh, your racialist views are so contrary to the values of Western civilization," it's fucking false, because prior to the Second World War, pretty much every country had a racialist norm, cultural norm. Australia was a white nationalist country. America was, like, the United States of America was white nationalist. Canada was white nationalist. New Zealand was white nationalist. There was clear racial consciousness in the countries of Europe.
Let's skip over a lot of gibber. We'll get to the point.
No. I am making actually a point.
You're just gibbering.
Is that it's not
your point is that white nationalism used to be the norm. Anything else? White nationalism used to be the norm. That's your point. Do you have another point besides that?
Well, you said that white nationalism is contrary to the values of Western civilization, but the values of Western civilization only come into existence in like the 1960s or something. Apparently, Western civilization didn't know what it was until the 1960s, and then it realized, Western
you mean
civilization
coincidentally
is all about being anti-racist. That was never what it was about.
So. Now I'm going to respond. So America is a different context because we've always had a huge black population here. But anti-racism starts taking off existentially, becoming widespread, because there before weren't a lot of non-white people in these countries. Australia didn't have a lot of non-white people in the first place.
Suppressed, like the blacks in America.
Joel, what was the primary basis for the white Australia policy? What is the actual material reason for it?
Because we are trying to maintain. Well, the idea was it was an outpost of the British race in Asia Pacific.
No, it was to protect the wages of the Australian workers from being depreciated. I told you
the entire labor movement was full of racists. I just read out to you the first ever Labor Prime
Minister.
You
are talking about the ponderings. You are talking about the derivative. You are talking about the derivative. You are talking about the derivative ponderings of some politician, which couldn't explain if his
it is how they all felt.
If
every single one of them, every single member of the Labor Party at that time was a racialist. Australia
the actual working class base of the Labor Party didn't care that much about it because in the Eureka Rebellion they joined.
You have no idea about the history of my country.
But in the
you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You're projecting your Marxist
ideology
gonna cry? Onto something you don't understand.
Are you actually going to cry right now? Are you going to cry because I'm talking against racism? You're actually a racist who's crying because your racist ideology is being exposed? During the Eureka Rebellion, they didn't give a fuck about race.
They don't give a fuck about Marxism. That's what they don't give a fuck about.
We can get to Marxism in a second. We get to Marxism in a second. During the Eureka Rebellion, they didn't give a fuck about race, though. How do you explain that?
They did.
Where?
was
Where?
wasted
What?
in
By what?
vice.
They welcomed the Chinese and the rebellions, so much so that the British started saying it was the result of foreign Chinese subversion. And by the way, it wasn't just the Chinese. It wasn't just the Chinese. And I'm going to ask you a question to see if your integrity is on point. Has the capitalist class in the history of Britain, America, and Australia stoked racial and ethnic differences, including between different European groups, but not exclusively, as a way to suppress the labor movement? Is that a tactic they've employed before?
Look, let's debate. I don't want to debate.
You can't even say yes. It's literally indisputable history. They pit the black and the white workers against each other. They did the same shit in Australia between the Irish, the Italians, the Anglo-Saxons, the Chinese. They do the same thing in fucking Europe and Britain between the Irish and the Anglo-Saxon Brits. They did the same thing in France. With the Algerians. The capitalist class foments racism to keep the working class disunited. It's a fact of history.
The capitalist class.
You are so dishonest you can't admit that. You are so dishonest you can't admit that.